We've all assembled. Thank you very much for this, and I think all of our attendees are still with us, which is fantastic. So let's just kick off this second session, the afternoon session of our conference, whose festival is it anyway. And then this kind of part two, I think we'll be looking at that balance in between the sustaining festivals and tourism, or sustainable festivals, and looking forward into the kind of future, really kind of extending the conversation from which Joyce had so ably kind of managed for us. So it's just my role here is to kind of introduce the panel chairs for the two sessions this afternoon. And I don't think I really even need to within our kind of audience, but can I welcome Stephen Jardine, who many of you know. Stephen is a Scottish journalist, a broadcaster, presenter with a very extensive career spanning the BBC, Scottish television, working in the Scotsman and various other kind of printed media. And of course, many of you will know Stephen's for his role in heading up the BBC's flagship programme, Debate Night on BBC Scotland, where in effect you'll be bringing those skills here in front of us today. So without any further ado, Stephen, if I can hand over to you and our panelists, and we look forward to another stimulating session. Thank you, Stephen.
Terry, afternoon, everyone. It was a real pleasure a year ago for me to moderate that packed public meeting in Toll Cross organised by the Cockburn Association, under the title City for Sale. I think we had over 700 people crammed into the hall that day. And as I remember it, the mood was real anger and frustration at how our precious city was being just ravaged by the demands of commercial operators facilitated by the council. Well, back then, the big question was, how do you stop this juggernaut that was the commercial exploitation of public spaces in Edinburgh? Well, I think the pandemic has done that. If COVID has been the great reset for society. This afternoon, we're going to focus on what comes next and what kind of festivals we want to see emerging out of all this. Our first session is going to focus on cultural tourism, what will be the new normal, and we'll follow that with festivalisation and climate change, managing the impacts on the city. So you've been doing a great job taking part in this discussion so far today. Please continue to do that via the chat and also on social media as well. You can follow the Cockburn Association. It's at the Cockburn on Facebook and at the Cockburn on Twitter as well. And our hashtag for the day, if you're sharing any of this on social media, is hashtag EdFests. So let's get started. Moving forward, what will be the new normal when it comes to cultural tourism and the festivals? We have three excellent panelists who you can see with us to share their views. I'll introduce each of them in turn and ask them to say a few words of introduction. And then we'll have maybe about half an hour or 35 minutes. And apologies if we go over any old ground on this. I only managed to catch the end of Joyce's brilliant last session, the last maybe 20 minutes of that, but we will be trying to move the focus on into different directions this afternoon. So our first panelist I want to introduce you to is Professor Jane Ali-Knight. Jane is currently leading and developing the Festival and Event Subject Group at Napier University, as well as lecturing at universities internationally and facilitating training and development in the field. She's the course director of the Executive Certificate in Festival and Event Management, which is delivered in Scotland and in the UAE, and the highly successful Destination Leaders Programme delivered in association with Scottish Enterprise. Jane's also a board member of the British Arts and Festival Association. Jane, thanks so much for your time joining us this afternoon. Maybe just to lay out initially from you, how do you think the pandemic and this break that we've seen in tourism and in cultural life in Edinburgh will impact what comes next?
Well, thank you, Stephen. So I thought I might just start by sort of saying, you know, what is cultural tourism and what does it bring to a city? So, I mean, obviously, people travel to destinations because of the artistic and cultural offer. And it seems to be a key driver to destinations. And I think there's been a lot written about this idea of festivalisation in terms of cities becoming event-led and places of festivals. And obviously that brings many impacts. And, you know, some of them are positive, and I think, you know, we've talked about a lot of them and they're evident in terms of things like employment, you know, contribution to well-being, infrastructure build, building a tourism infrastructure. But also I think it brings many negative impacts as well. And I think that's probably what we've seen the focus being on in Edinburgh, particularly in the last few years. And I think, you know, you've talked a lot about it in terms of things like commodification of our public spaces, over-exploitation of our cultural resources, of which the festival is a key one that we have. It's, you know, one of the key reasons why people come and visit the city, particularly domestic tourists. And also it has a huge impact on the life of our resident population. So I think what COVID has offered us is this pause. You know, it's allowed us the opportunity to basically reset the debate and the discussion around how the cultural offer is delivered in the city. And I think the one thing that's been evident to me as an Edinburgh resident and a festival goer is that the city is completely different without that cultural offer. You know, it lacks any sort of vibrancy. It's not just the cultural sector that's been impacted, it's that whole sort of infrastructure that helps to deliver the festivals. And I think the key contribution that the festivals bring to developing the destination. So I think a festival, Edinburgh as a festival city without festivals is a very sort of sad place. And we realise that, yeah, we do need the festivals and we do need that cultural offering, but what we do need is balance. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about building back better, but I think it's building back balanced, you know. So again, this morning, lots of the panellists have talked about this in terms of how do we create a more balanced approach to how the festivals are delivered and also how the city receives them. And not just the city itself, but also the residents. So I think what COVID has done is it's pressed that pause button and it's given us an opportunity to completely rethink that festival model and how it integrates and works with the city. And I think this morning we've talked a lot about sort of grassroots development, you know, embedding the festivals more within the local communities. And I think that a lot of the festivals have been doing some really interesting and innovative things in that area, but that needs to be extended, expanded, and it needs to be supported. And I think it was Julia that said, you know, the risk needs to be shared as well. It can't just be the festival's responsibility. It has to be both businesses, commercial operators in the city, outside of festivals, but also the public sector. So the sort of holy trinity of people working together. So I suppose they're just some initial thoughts.
Jane, thank you. Our second panellist this afternoon joining us is Donald Emslie. Donald began his working life as a teacher, but made an early career change into sales and marketing. He joined STV in the mid-1980s and became chief executive of SMG Television, as it was then, in 1999, a role he held until 2007. Since then, over the last 20 years, Donald has held a range of non-exec appointments, including the Royal Zoological Society of Edinburgh, the Royal Lyceum Theatre, the Scottish Arts Council, Scottish Screen, and several more as well. And last year, he became chairperson of the Scottish Tourism Action Group, ETAG, an umbrella partnership of private and public sector representatives that jointly coordinates tourism development in Edinburgh. Donald, thanks for your time this afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Just to set out your stall at the beginning of this, what do you see as being, what do you think is going to be the new normal for cultural tourism and festivals moving forward?
Well, thanks, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I took over the chair of the Edinburgh Tourism Action Group in the white heat of that debate that you were holding last year, Stephen, about the debate about what was happening in the city at that time. And shortly after that, we published our 10-year strategy, which was a very clear departure from what had happened before, which was all about growth in the tourism industry into Edinburgh. But our new strategy, which has been delayed because of the pandemic and delayed in the development of it because of the pandemic, but our new strategy is very much about managing the tourism product and about making sure that, you know, that our key platforms for the tourism strategy going forward is about people, it's about place, it's about environment, reputation and partnership. And it's a very different take on what perhaps the tourism industry had strived to do before. And it picks up a lot of the key points that Jane was making there. The tourism sector represents £2 billion of income into Edinburgh. So it's a very valuable part of the Edinburgh and the Scottish economy. And it does go towards making Edinburgh a vibrant, entertaining, very sought after place for people to come and work and live and invest here in the city. But I agree with Jane. I think what the pandemic has given us is an opportunity to pause, to rethink what needs to happen in the future. And people talk about building back better. I prefer building forward better. And I think it does have to be balanced. And I think the tourism industry needs to work much closer with the city and the communities that are living in the city about how we can all enjoy the tourism product and welcome the visitors into the city in a much more managed and sustainable way going forward. And I think it's probably, and I'm sure it was mentioned this morning, and I wasn't able to join all of the sessions this morning, but you know, the original ambition of the festivals back in just after the war was to bring the world together in mutual understanding of the cultural offer. And I think cultural tourism does offer a huge benefit to Edinburgh, which is a relatively small city, but it opens up Edinburgh to the world and welcomes the world into Edinburgh every year in an event that is a huge event. You know, it's Julia said this morning, the visitor numbers are about as big as the World Cup and just slightly smaller than the Olympics. And it happens every year in Edinburgh. And I think we have to cherish that because it brings a lot to our city and adds a lot to the experience of living in the city. But it has to be nurtured and it has to be managed going forward, and it has to be different. There's no doubt about that.
Donald, thank you very much indeed. Our third panellist, last but not least this afternoon, is Professor David McGillivray. David currently focuses on two primary areas of academic research. The first examines the contemporary significance of events and festivals as markers of identity and mechanisms for the achievement of wider economic, social and cultural benefits. The second explores how digital and social media enables and constrains participation in civic life. In addition to his other publications, 3 years ago, David co-authored A Resistance, a detailed study of the politics, strategies and tactics that underpin the processes used to secure major sporting and cultural events around the world. David, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. How do you think the pandemic will influence how Edinburgh re-emerges as a cultural destination?
Thank you, Stephen. I think it's important, and I think Jane and Donald have both mentioned that festivals are incredibly important for cities. I mean, we heard this morning about residents, cultural workers, businesses. You know, all these people depend on festivals, and I think festivals have strong relationships with cities. You know, we often perceive the whole debate about cultural tourism, I guess, in Edinburgh is that places are perceived often by their festivals. So internationally, Edinburgh's renowned because of its festivals, as are several other cities that we might be able to identify. I think the trajectory over time has been, we mentioned festivalization, that you know, there are impacts, tangible and intangible, on when you bring lots of festivals together over a kind of tight time period, like we heard earlier. And there are impacts that come from that. And over the pre-COVID period in Edinburgh, we saw that really building up to almost an extent of a crescendo. And I mean, the City for Sale event was a reflection of a crescendo about that, the balance becoming problematic for people. And so I think it's important that we hit essentially what some people have described as peak event. There was peak event. We're seeing that in the context of sport and events, but also cultural events. And of course, the pandemic impacted on that. And of course, tourism has been really significantly affected by the pandemic. I mean, hardly any industry, tourism events industry, has been really challenged. And of course, in the preceding period, the build-up had meant that these had become extremely valuable industries. And of course, industries don't necessarily have a right to survive. There are other industries that haven't survived in our economy over recent years. But we've built these up over the last decade or more. And now there's a challenge around survival. And there's a challenge about survival for these industries, and what we would want to keep and what we would really want to encourage: good jobs, with well-paid jobs, with sustainable careers in them, so that you don't want something that's not like that in the economy. And I think that's something that, as we look to COVID and beyond, how do we manage this sort of shock to the system that this has actually produced? Because it's a shock to our political, our social, and our economic life. And obviously tourism central to that. And I think one of the things that COVID has also done, because of the fact that we can't have mass gatherings, we can't have large scale events, is it's kind of affected the relationship between festivals and cities. And that relationship is usually about the transmission and reception of culture, which we've heard about this morning. It's an important element. The kind of maintaining and creating place identity, another kind of key reason why festivals have been really successful. And also increasingly intrinsic part of the economy. And I guess that part in the end, I heard Morven Cunningham earlier talking about, we have to have kind of shared decision making and a focus not just on economic power, but on other kind of forms of power. And I think that certainly is something that we're having to think about in a kind of post-COVID environment. And I think COVID is, when we think about maybe recovery beyond a period where COVID is the kind of main thing we talk about, you've got kind of issues associated with mobility. Mobility in the world is going to change. It's changed already. There's clearly a lack of mobility, and confidence, public confidence in mobility, is going to be a massive issue for cities trying to attract people to their shores, and also kind of economic and public policy, which again we heard a bit about this morning, is going to be really interesting. So, is there investment? Where's the investment in the public purse going to come from? Is that for festivals? Does that mean that they have to think about the way that they increase the value of their social purpose, their health and well-being agenda, so that the public finances that may be available are being directed towards these kind of areas of activity, because that will then be important. We talked at the City of Sale event about space, the city, and where things take place within the city, and how the capacity of certain areas to take those numbers of people will clearly be a continuing debate. That they're empty at the moment, which I think, as Jane said, is not a great feeling. It's not a great look. But they were too full, or certain areas of cities, civic areas of cities, were being perhaps overused as part of the period before the COVID pandemic. I think you're going to have to look at issues around about hybrid models. I mean, we've talked a lot about hybrid in the last few months, but there are some festivals can do some elements of their work in an online way, and it works quite well. There are other elements that are completely dependent on place. Place is crucial, and outdoor space is crucial. I think you also need to think about the types of festivals and events that might be possible in the next 2 or 3 years. Light installations, light kind of tours. These have been successful in the last few months, even because they are mobile people walking through spaces, projecting things onto buildings, projecting things, sounds into spaces, are kind of innovative ways around some of the problems of mass gathering. And can still be attractive potentially to tourism. So there's a kind of capacity issues in there that I think the pause that Jane mentioned does give a chance to think about these. I guess my kind of final point would be, I think one of the challenges is that the really crescendo of attention in Edinburgh in late 2019 and 20 was leading to some pretty interesting public debate. I think because of the pandemic, I think obviously you don't have that same debate about what the festivals might look like in the future, because people are just trying to survive at the moment, literally survive in terms of the industry, the opportunities. And so the fear might be that once things hopefully do release, that you are straight back into the need to try and generate more of that business without necessarily thinking about what were the issues we had a year and a half ago. So that would be where I'd kind of finish for the moment, Stephen.
Thank you, David. Let's dig in and explore that a little bit more. On the last session with Joyce, we talked about how integral the festivals are to Edinburgh. And Jane, you were saying what a sad place that Edinburgh is without festivals around. And that's kind of dividing people on the chat, because, for all of us who live in the city, the green spaces at the moment, the open spaces of the city are our exercise. They're a chance to get out of the home and get some fresh air and exercise. Gillian says Edinburgh without the festivals has been amazing. Who else? Somebody else was saying that as well. Digital access is, we'll come back to that, actually, digital access a little bit later. Sue here, the city's felt very sad and empty without all the festival buzz. And Louise, the city centre has been very quiet, but interesting to see busier local communities outside of the city centre despite the pandemic. Absolutely, places like Stockbridge and Morningside, you can really see that. There's a couple of other voices which I managed to lose here as well, those saying, for them, the city does not feel sad. For them, it feels, perhaps for the first time in a long time, like their city again, Jane.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, it all goes back to this idea of balance, doesn't it? I mean, obviously, there's a lot that Edinburgh has to offer as a city, apart from the festivals. But I think the festivals do bring an added vibrancy to the city. And I think the issue has been, I don't actually think there has been an issue of over-tourism, although I recognise all the things that people are saying. But I think it's been that tourism has been undermanaged. I think, there probably is over-tourism 2 or 3 weeks of the year in the peak time of the festivals. But around that time, a lot of the time in Edinburgh, we're not seeing peak visitation. We're not seeing our city really crowded. So I think it's been an issue of undermanagement and a lack of understanding and a lack of leadership within the city in terms of looking at, in terms of not just destination marketing, but more as destination development and management. So I think, yes, it has given us the opportunity for the city to breathe, which is great, and we've been able to explore our city in a different way, and especially the natural spaces within the city, because we've had the opportunity to go and walk around and see it. And, I would agree that's been amazing as well. But I think that, that can't continue forever. And obviously, as David was saying as well, economically, it can't continue forever, because the festivals do bring an injection of money into the economy. And also, a lot of the people that attend the festivals are from Edinburgh and from Scotland. It's still the biggest audience. It isn't, international tourists. So I think it's obviously a very contentious issue, and there are lots of challenges. But I personally feel that the festivals do bring that added vibrancy to the city, and we do need them. But what we do also need is we need them to be more grassroots. We need them to be more embedded with the local community. We need the city to have more ownership of them. I think, the ownership has completely shifted, where we're living in a city where we don't feel we have that ownership, and we don't feel we have that voice within how the cities, how the festivals are delivered. So I think there's lots of challenges there. And what we do need more than anything at the moment is we need leadership to lead that discussion and lead that debate. We've lost our DMO in Marketing Edinburgh. So, where does that discussion lie now, and who's going to take it forward?
Yeah, well, we have Donald with us this afternoon. So let's begin to that. Let me just read a comment out though from Fiona. As a city centre resident, I feel absolutely pushed out by the rush for greater tourism, regardless of the impact and effect in the city centre. Basically, Airbnb, short-term lets are destroying the beating, vibrant heart of the city. And without the core heart, the tourists will stop coming. It has become a tourist theme park. And this past year has been amazing. Simply able to walk out of the house and go to the post office. Donald, as the man in charge of ETAG here, keep talking about balance. But who's responsible for achieving that balance and enforcing that balance and pushing back against some of the big operators who think they'll decide where the balance lies?
Well, it is about management and balance, and I think it's also about planning for the future in terms of everyone who has got a part to play in this. Stephen needs to be part of that planning. As chair of ETAG, I work very closely with the City of Edinburgh Council. We've got a strategy implementation group which is made up of all of the major agencies, Visit Scotland, Scottish Enterprise. But interestingly, since I took the role on, I encouraged the inclusion of community representatives, and sitting on that strategy implementation group, we've now got the chair of the Old Town Community Council and the chair of Edinburgh World Heritage. So we are, and that community engagement will have to develop as we look to, the actions that we're going to have to work on in order to, effect the 10-year strategy and the plan for tourism going out to 2030. But I mean, there's been lots of debate over Airbnb and short-term lets. There's current legislation going through the Scottish Parliament, which will no doubt have an impact in that area. But it's we can learn, and we have been learning from other cities. Amsterdam is a case in point where we've been working quite closely with the tourism authorities in Amsterdam, and what they did was they encouraged all of the tourists not just to go to the city centre and do the 2 or 3 things that everyone goes to Amsterdam to do, but to go out into the communities, different parts of the city, and be a local in the city. And that's had an enormous impact on spreading the benefit of the visitor economy around Amsterdam. And you mentioned, Stephen, the local areas, Stockbridge or Bruntsfield or Portobello, Leith. And we're working very closely with Edinburgh City Council about a Shop Local campaign, about encouraging people to stay local, to shop local. But at the same time, when you monitor the statistics in the city centre, the people coming into the city centre now is 90% below where it was this time last year. The occupancy in the hotels are 90% below. The restaurants, were 60, 70% below. That's when they were open. There is an economic impact on this that it can't continue, because these businesses have to survive. They have to welcome back people, and they have to survive to be able to sustain, the 30,000 plus jobs that are involved in tourism and hospitality. It's a very big sector, and it needs to come back, and it needs to be sustainable for the future. But I completely accept that it needs to be managed, and there needs to be a balance here about the impact it has in the city, particularly, as James mentioned, during the 3 critical weeks of August, when it, I suppose when you look back in 2019, that was when it reached its peak that David was talking about.
Do we have over-tourism in Edinburgh, Donald?
I'm like Jane, I don't think we do. I think there are several weeks in the year when it becomes, during August, when the 5 festivals are running, and I think it needs certain areas of the city do suffer from over-tourism, but the whole city doesn't. And I think that comes back to about managing and planning and how you can distribute that around the city, and also look at how that can be spread out across the year. But I don't think it necessarily suffers from over-tourism 52 weeks of the year.
On the chat, Pat just picks up on that point you're making. Local communities have become so much more important to people during COVID. Might this help develop local offerings of locally generated events. I also think we have a good year-round theatres being more sustainable as a spin-off from the boost during the festival period. David, back to balance. How do we achieve it, and who's responsible for achieving it?
Well, I was going to pick up on these points about distribution. I think it's really crucial. The cities that we are going to live in the next few years are facing significant challenges, but the kind of spatial distribution, I mean, there's lots of debates about things like 15-minute cities where people in their neighborhoods can access all of the things that you would want. I mean, arts, you know, shopping, all those things, as opposed to this drive to the city centre. And I think that's a really interesting strategic and really quite visionary kind of debates that we need to have, is about what is the city centre for. You've got the same in Glasgow. You've got a city centre in Glasgow dependent on people coming into the city centre. So to develop this kind of footfall and traffic, we don't have spectacular events, and they're not going to come back in those scale anytime soon. So I think there is some really interesting thinking that needs to be had about how you can spatially distribute these kind of festivals and events. And over time, we heard that this morning, debates about there's good reason why you wouldn't want to stretch it out over time, perhaps because this buzz of a 4-week event is important. But you know, given the spatial issues that we've got in terms of COVID, post-COVID, about how many people will be able to gather and when, there probably is going to have to be, you know, thinking around about that to stretch that out. I think the local offer in the neighbourhoods, I mean, I think again, you can do that with the way you distribute funding. You can develop a really strong cultural offer in neighbourhoods, and I think we've all experienced our neighbourhoods in very different ways during COVID, and people I think are less certain at the moment about going back into city centres in the traditional way anyway, for work and other activities. So I think planning wise, cities are going to have to really think about what their city centres are, just like we've had debates about town centres for so long, in the sense of how do you kind of revitalise town centres where retail's not the kind of primary objective of those spaces. So I think neighbourhood type festivals that become excellent, so they're not local community and not high quality, they're excellent, I think are going to be more important as we go forward. And as I said, I think the renewed focus on broader social values as well as this, you know, as well as the economic agenda is going to be important, because I think, you know, people do enjoy festivals, they do enjoy experiencing arts and culture. So I think during the pandemic, people felt, you know, more engaged probably. I think in Ireland, I think there was kind of increased investment actually in arts and culture has come out of the pandemic, which is interesting. So again, in this kind of austerity agenda, you know, it may be that there are some things that we realise are actually more important than we really thought, you know, or were struggling to make the case for pre-pandemic. And I think, you know, that will be interesting. And as I said, the final part I would make was about the kind of hybrid agenda. I think we are going to be able to have some events that are kind of still gatherings, but that can be projected and experienced online, and we can see other things that never really needed to be held in particular places, but have maybe been held in places just because there was a kind of need to contain people for a media spectacle. And ultimately, we have to accept that that's what events have become for many people. They've become a mechanism through which you project your city image-wise, visually. And you contain people in a particular space because that carries a value when you market out to the world. If you can't do that, then you have to be more creative, because you're not going to be able to put people in that space, and whether it's Princess Gardens or Street Gardens or whatever. And so I think you have to think differently then about the way you use the resources that you do have to be able to still ensure you've got good quality festivals, events that local people benefit from, that city residents benefit from, and that can actually be monetized in some way, but perhaps in a more sustainable way.
Thank you. A good question from Tom McEwen, I want to deal with in just a second. But just back to you, Jane, you live in the city. It's part of the challenge around all this for Edinburgh that there are two things going on here. We're a cultural city, especially in the summer months, and we are a heritage historical city all year round. And those two things don't necessarily sit terribly easily together. When you have huge numbers of people coming here for these cultural events, what's the impact that you see as a resident on the heritage part of the city?
Yeah, well, I think obviously, you know, we're a World Heritage Site, aren't we? So that imposes even more restrictions on what can be delivered. So yeah, obviously, you know, at certain times of the year, we do see negative impacts on our local heritage in terms of congestion, pollution, waste management, you know, and really the carrying capacity being exceeded in terms of the number of people that can cohabit, you know, harmoniously and sustainably within the city. But I actually live in Stockbridge, and so I think it's been really interesting that sort of. I heard somebody talk about localhood the other day, which I thought was a really interesting sort of way of describing it. You know, that people have basically retreated back to their local neighbourhoods because of COVID, and that has been one really positive thing. And I think with Stockbridge, we had great fringe venues here. We had a theatre, but all that has been lost over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. And, you know, I did run a sort of small scale community festival here for a few years as well. But, you know, again, we had many challenges in running that festival. So I think maybe, you know, one thing that we do need is that dispersion out into those local communities. You know, those local communities have been reinvigorated and re-engaged, and we need to harness that in terms of that festival delivery model moving out into those suburbs again, you know, and reinvigorating those cultural venues that did exist here, because the resident buy-in is here in the local. But I think, you know, it is a real challenge, you know, and I don't think it's a challenge that just Edinburgh faces. You know, many cities face the same challenge. You know, we talk about, you know, places like Amsterdam and Barcelona and many cities around the world that have that strong heritage offer as well. You know, so tourism obviously isn't a panacea, and it's not going to be the solution economically as well. But I think, again, it goes back to what we've been saying all morning, which is it's all about research. It's all about looking at what the city can sustain. You know, what is the carry capacity? What are the optimum amount? And a lot of that has been enforced on us at the moment, hasn't it, because of COVID? Because, you know, we've just done some work with the University of Edinburgh where we've tried to sort of remodel what the festivals could look like. You know, if we're going to impose the strict COVID restrictions on them. And I think, you know, it's going to be very, very difficult to monetize that. And so this is why we're seeing this growth in hybrid events as well, which I think is fantastic. And I think there's a place for both live experience and that virtual model as well. So I think in terms of, you know, tourism coexisting in a heritage place, this is a challenge that many, many cities face, and I think there's probably very few of them that have actually done it. But again, it goes back to discussion, research, management issues, planning, effective planning. You know, these are the sort of things that we can do to try and help sort of mitigate a lot of those issues.
Thank you. And that was Tom's question, actually. For you, David, is hybrid the way forward from now on? Is hybrid the way that we keep what we've had and what we've achieved, but we find a new way of doing it that is more equal and is more sustainable for the city?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously one point to make is that online activities aren't always that environmentally sustainable either. Maybe we're going to end up reflecting much more on that when we think about the amount of energy that we use in these spaces too. But I think, you know, we're not going to have much choice. I think that there's going to be events that are going to have to be delivered digitally. And personally, I don't find the digital and online experience that bad. And I think sometimes, and I've just sort of responded to Tommy, sometimes we kind of tend to overemphasize the importance of just physically gathering together. Of course, it's important to the way that we experience our neighborhoods, our cities, and people enjoy being part of a festival crowd, etc. We get that, but we're having to reset that understanding, and there will be opportunities to do that again. But I think the challenges of the hybrid event are certainly around about monetizing. But I think there's been some really interesting work on that. You know, if you value something, you're likely to be able to be happy enough to pay for it. I think talks about the people who are interested in that festival would value it more and would have paid more to watch it online than they were asked to pay, because they were testing it in the initial phases. You're testing what's their willingness to pay, and I think that's where a lot of the research probably needs to go, to say, you can actually probably widen your audience, because for certain, especially cultural activities, I think people would be willing to watch it and participate. Book festivals are a great example, I think, because of the nature of that. You listen to an author talk about their book online, not just in the physical space, probably isn't that much worse than being there. So I think there'll certainly need to be mixed models for the way that those are funded. I don't think we're at a stage where financially that any of the festivals could go online completely and make enough money to sustain them. But then I think one of the questions is what does a sustainable festival look like going forward, in terms of how big they need to be, what kind of funding model to survive, and that's something I guess it's going to be discussed over the next kind of 6 months to a year at least.
Thank you. Yeah, Danielle on the chat is saying hybrid festivals likely the way forward for many reasons: access, environmental inclusion, but there are also the economies of festivals that need to be addressed here. Just what you're talking about, how this impacts on how a festival is financed in the absence of ticket income, if people will pay the same for content behind a paywall, etc. The technology that needs to be required to produce high broadcast quality content. We'll all be watching, I think, with great interest what happens with the book festival, what they manage to achieve if they can do that with some of their online content this year. Donald, what's your view? Is hybrid the way this needs to be moving forward?
Well, I think David's raised some really interesting points to that we could discuss for a very long time, rather than just the 10 minutes or so we've got left. But I think it does depend on the nature of the festival. I think the book festival lends itself to a hybrid model. I'm not sure the Fringe necessarily lends itself to a hybrid model. A lot of the content can be online, but the vibrancy and the personal experience of the Fringe, being in close proximity with a number of other people experiencing that, that same moment that, of your regular goers of the Fringe, you come across artists that you see, and you can really discuss it with your friends and family afterwards, that you've all enjoyed it together at the same time. And I think that's a unique Fringe experience, which probably doesn't lend itself to hybrid. So I think there will be a number of models. There's no doubt in my mind, however, Stephen, that technology, whether it's a hybrid model or some kind of model, digital infrastructure and digital technology that can help move people around a city safely, that can move people in and out of festivals safely, will be something that will become normal in the future. And we're doing a lot of work with the Digital Innovation Department up at Edinburgh University, just about how you can track people around the city using their phones and cameras, and help display where, which parts of the city are less congested. So they point people and direct people to less congested parts of the city, rather than allowing bottlenecks to be created because people are always going to the same locations. So hybrid, yes, but digital technology will be absolutely critical to the festivals in the future.
Here's an idea just for us to explore in the last few minutes we've got left on this session. We effectively had a fallow year last year in Edinburgh with no festivals taking place. Glastonbury choose to have a fallow year every few years to allow the environment to recover, to allow the environment to breathe. Julian says fallow-free festival weeks give our regular cultural venues a chance to have an audience. Is there something in, perhaps every few years, Edinburgh taking a break in August, which would give the city a chance to breathe, would give the city residents a chance to breathe, but might also make people focus on what they actually appreciate and have in a festival city? David, you go first on this.
I think it depends on where you come from, where you're sitting on that debate. If you're a resident, you might see that as being a really good thing, and otherwise, I think For me, this goes back to the logic of the way that festivals have developed, to the point where these are industries. And therefore, to imagine a fallow year for an industry that's dependent on that in terms of jobs and otherwise, that probably seems completely impossible. But that's partly because we've got to a point where there are so many interests built into that industry operating. So you would have to, and that's my point about maybe the pause that we're having now, the broader reflections on public policy, economic policy, to say, well, if we do want our festivals to exist, and in what way do we want them to exist? What do we need to do in order to ensure that we don't need a fallow year, because they are being built back, whether we call it better or future, in such a way that they more effectively relate to place, they're more equally spatially distributed, that the shared power that Morven talked about earlier is there. The right people are discussing. So Donald talks about having different types of representatives in the strategy groups. I mean, I think that's really important, but it certainly can't be tokenistic, because otherwise we'll get back to the same place. So it's how do you share power to make decisions about urban life and planning? That goes against quite a lot of what we've been seeing in the last decade previously. So that requires quite a lot of leadership to cede power, of course, which is in itself very difficult. But I think that's where probably, if you're not going to avoid coming back to the same place quite soon, that's the sort of change in thinking processes that we would probably need.
Donald, you were saying earlier, you work with the council in ETAG on an ongoing basis on this stuff. Why aren't they having this conversation? Why is it down to the Cockburn Association and all of us to be sitting here on a Saturday afternoon doing this? Why is the council not driving this conversation?
Well, I mean, I suppose the council are having conversations, Stephen, but maybe they're not public. But they certainly have the conversation with us round the table, and they're having, they're represented at the, not only at ETAG, but they're represented at the Festivals Forum. They're doing work with the Poverty Commission and the Sustainability Group that's been created in order to look at the carbon footprint of and presumably when we come on to talk at the next session, that will be in discussion. But you're right. I mean, the city is critical to this, because they are the planning and licensing authority. So they are absolutely critical to this debate. And we all need to make sure that we are, involving them, and as much as I try to involve the communities, involving the city in our ongoing planning is just as important, because, the fallow year works for Glastonbury, I think, because, one, they've got a very good reason to have a fallow year, because they've got a farm to run, and the farm needs the fallow year. And also the talent have got more opportunities to go elsewhere. It's slightly different with the participants of the festival and Fringe perhaps don't have as many opportunities to demonstrate their creativity and their skills. So it needs to be an annual event, which really comes back to, I think, the whole question about planning for this, making sure that we've got a balanced approach to everything, but also I think in investment. The look at the book festival. The book festival have moved from Charlotte Square to the festival, the Edinburgh Art School, the Edinburgh University Art School. I think the cost of moving to a hybrid event, but also having to stage, and build an infrastructure every year and then take it down and repair what the damage has been done to the garden was just too much for them. So if we are looking for these festivals, the 11 festivals to be sustainable, we need to be talking about investing in the infrastructure to allow them to come back in a sustainable way and perhaps be less disruptive to the community in so doing.
Deirdre says, not sure the residents feel the council's priorities are the same as the residents' priorities. Jane, you work worldwide on this stuff. Do we get in Edinburgh the leadership that you would expect from the council, from the local authority, when it comes to the big decision making about how the festivals operate and what they should be moving forward?
I think that's a hot potato, isn't it? So I think it's very difficult. I think they're in a really difficult position, but I think at the moment, probably no. I mean, I think, I think within the council, and this is obviously wider issues in the council in terms of funding and funding being diverted into other areas, that we haven't really got a strong sort of tourism or event delivery mechanism within the council. We had that years ago, but we haven't got that anymore. Then obviously we've seen, the loss of our DMO, Marketing Edinburgh. So that's another, that was obviously an arm's length organisation to the council. So again, we've lost that. So there's no real mechanism now within the council. And, thank God we do have organisations like ETAG that are acting as that mediator, and talking to the council. But again, their remit is different. Scottish Enterprise is looking at economic development, and tourism's one part of that. But I think, destinations where they've got that really strong buy-in, from a public government, local authority level, are ones that will succeed, because, they're an integral part in all this, because in terms of particularly going forward, public health, they're going to be a key part of delivering that public health message, planning, legislation, everything. So we definitely, I don't think at the moment we do have that leadership, but within the tourism economy, we have lots of expertise and we have lots of passionate people, and we have, an amazing tourism and festival product within the city, but it's all completely disjointed. I think that's the problem. It needs to be harnessed. And I think over the last maybe 5 years, the festivals and the city and tourism are definitely working together much stronger. And I'm sure Donald can sort of evidence that. But I think maybe at the moment, the sort of public part of that is the weak link.
Okay. Jane, thank you. David, just briefly, yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do think there's a really interesting point about kind of deliberative forms of democracy or otherwise. This event is quite large. If you just look at the chat and the kind of range of not just views but ideas, and one of the things that are real weaknesses, and I'm not just about Edinburgh here, but is the way that we actually find out what the people think in that broader sense. There are lots of issues about who are the communities and how, etc. Loud voices, quiet voices, but consultations and the way consultations are done tend to reinforce the problem, because they tend to be quite agenda driven, and they tend to use particular platforms to get, you have to go to a particular place that the council decides is the place you go. And of course, some people who are representative know what to do and know how to go there. If you just look at the way the chat's working here, and I think we need to open up the way that we think about a conversation about what maybe the festivals mean to the city. Glasgow just had I don't know if you maybe remember, a city conversation about George Square. Now that's a contested space too. But what's interesting is there's a wide range of different methods used to gather views on what the city, that particular space might be looked at, and it included what events might be held in that particular space. So I think there's a point there about how we do local democracy and how we can feed that into the process that maybe would deal with issues of ownership when it comes to the kind of issues that we're talking about today.
Absolutely, and I think we've demonstrated that in this session this afternoon. There's an interesting discussion going on in the chat about this, the fallow, the possibility of fallow and how that might work. The other thing we haven't had time to explore is really the Christmas markets, which a lot of people have got strong views on. We will definitely do that in the next session this afternoon, but we're out of time for right now. Time for a cup of tea just about, because we're supposed to start again at 2:15 for the next one. But please thank Jane, Donald and David for a really interesting session, and brilliantly supported by all of you on the chat. Thank you very, very much indeed for your time this afternoon. We'll be back in just under 10 minutes for the next session this afternoon. We'll see you all then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.